Hey Infinity fans, big news, N5 is here and we're deep diving into the changes as we see them from N4 to N5. From new troop types to combat mechanics, we're going to cover off everything that's new, so stick around and learn the updates from N4 to N5. A big shout out first off to Clint Florker, John Wesley Osidna, and the whole Infinity community for banding together and being able to make sense of some of these changes, putting them into documents, writing comments on Facebook, jumping into the Discord, and even on the forums to discuss these rules and outline their key interpretations and what they've spotted that has been different. It's made this job a lot easier in compiling all of them. I also want to give a big shout out to Bryn, who has helped with the questions that I've had about some of the rules, and Tony in my local meta to help me understand some of these changes so that I can do this video for you. One of my favourite changes that's coming in with N5 is simplification of order expenditure and some new basic types of movement. There's been some confusion historically around what skills you can do, the order that you can do them in, and there's a lot of cleanup here in N5, which I am absolutely here for. We have 3 different skill types now. There is a long skill type, which replaces the entire order mechanic, so not much of a change, just a name change. We then have short skills, which is what everyone will remember from N4 and earlier, but we also have basic short skills now. There's a lot more clarification around which skills you can use in combination of each other as shown there. Basic short skills only make up 3 different types, which is an idle, a discover, and a move. They must always make up the first declaration of your order before you then go in and declare either a second basic short skill or a short skill. Alternatively, you can declare a long skill and that takes up both of the allocations there and replaces 2 separate skills with 1 singular long skill. A lot simpler, a lot more straightforward, and I think a lot more beginner friendly. Another thing we noticed in the movement mechanic that is a big change from N4 is kind of squeezing around corners. There was a lot of discussion in N4 as to whether you could cut corners and squeeze through them like you could narrower gaps that were at least the same width as your silhouette or bigger. You veterans are going to absolutely love this. Peaking is back in N5. Troopers may move up to half their silhouette value off a supporting surface during a movement in order to lean out or peak at something below or above them. This is primarily to gain line of fire to targets. Talking of movement and some things that you might be familiar with, prone is getting a small update in that you can now end your movement prone or start your movement prone. Another movement change for N5 is that jumping and climbing have a standard movement of 6 inches regardless of what your movement values are. This makes it very easy and we love it. That's enough about movement. Let's talk about a strange mechanic that's come in for N5 that I really want to talk about, and that is modern limited insertion. So there is a bit of confusion around this rule and will probably get clarified in no time at all. At the moment, there's a rule that says if during the tactical phase or the order generation phase, a list has only generated 10 orders, then you cannot strip 2 orders from that pool. One of the confusions there is in the wording. It says if the army list contains 10 orders, which makes us wonder if that includes the private information of hidden deployment and airborne deployment, or if it means during the tactical phase, if only 10 orders have been generated at the start of the game, then you cannot strip orders. That level of ambiguity is unfortunate, but what I would recommend if that hasn't been resolved by the time this video goes out is that you just talk to your teammate when you're doing list building as to how you want to be playing that until Corpus Belli comes out with a clarification as to whether it is the army list, which is how it's worded towards the second half of that, or whether it's the orders that were generated during the tactical phase, which is also in the same rules for this. So all your command tokens, there's a new one, Speedball. You spend 1 command token to get 2 Speedball tokens. May only be done 1 time and immediately after deployment. You want to be checking out the Speedball rules as early as you can because that is a fun new mechanic that's coming to M5. A very significant change is the dismounting of bikes and tags. You can't do it anymore. How this has been replaced is that some tags have peripherals that can be deployed or used to do the objectives and do all the things that you probably would have done with your tag pilots beforehand. There's also no auto eject functionality. That's been replaced by a new transmutation, which is also worth looking at, very specific to only certain tags. And then same with the motorcycle dismount. There is one exception to this technically, and that is the AI motorcycle within Nomads, but that is replaced by a new transmutation state where the AI motorcycle effectively changes into an AI standing transformer type unit. But effectively, all tags, all motorcycles have lost the ability for their riders to dismount them. That is a crazy big change for M5. Another very cool change, and I love this one because I actually liked the REM drivers, REM racers. I love them, but I haven't used them in a little while because they buff other things, and I really quite liked that approach. That is now tag.com, and it takes the same philosophy but applies it to tags. Any user or a unit that has tag.com applies that buff to all the tags in the same combat group. And yes, tags can be buffed by multiple units with tag.com to turn into super beast tags. I think this is going to be quite a cool mechanic towards list building. A couple of things that have gone, or at least had enough of a major rechange that we need to say that they're gone. Bioimmunity, completely disappearing. Also, immunity total has disappeared. In a sense, it has been replaced with immunity armor, immunity BTS, but I think that's good because it just clears things up and makes things a bit simpler by having it in brackets as to what it's immune to, which is pretty cool. There's huge overhauls to the combat mechanics. I'm going to start with the biggest one that you'll need to be familiar with to be playing M5, and that is PS. That is replacing the damage mechanic within N4, N3, and everything that's happened beforehand. And what it stands for is possibility of survival. This is really bringing in line the saving throws in M5 to all the other dice mechanics that exist. If you remember historically, armor saves were one of those weird things where you had to roll above a value, even though with everything else, the success value was very explicit and you had to roll the success value or lower. Possibility of survival brings that damage mechanic way back into the rest of everything that's going on in Infinity. So what you'll see is a PS value on weapons. It'll be PS equals 5. What you have to do is roll a 5 or lower. Now you can add your armor and everything else and cover onto that, but that PS value is equal to or lower than pre-modifiers. Another thing that's changed that will shock quite a few veteran players is how critical mechanics are now different in M5. The key thing here is that while they do roll over, they roll over in a very, very different way. So let's say you have a unit with CC24. Now historically in M4 that would do two things. It would add 4 to your final dice value, so if you rolled a 4 on your dice you could basically add that up to 8. But it also meant that a crit would count in a 16 or above. A little bit more complicated than it needs to be, even though everyone who played it probably understands it. The new crit mechanic is a little bit different. If you have a CC24 unit, you crit on 20s, but then it rolls down. And so a 1, 2, 3, or 4 is also a critical success value. I do quite like this because again, I think it's a little bit simpler when you're trying to do quick maths in your head. A couple of other things have taken a bit of an overhaul that will be quite surprising. Shock is not gone, but in N4, Shock worked on 2 wound models. Basically, if something wasn't shock immune, it would take them out. That does change ever so slightly in N5, where Shock doesn't take multi-wound models straight to debt if they don't have shock immunity. So a little bit of a dilution of shock as a mechanic, but there are only a few models that had 2 wounds but didn't have shock immunity. Shock also doesn't work on anything with structure. Guided has been changed. Lots of people were calling for its change. I don't know that it's been reworked as massively as everyone wants. Effectively, you can only use the blast mode version of Guided if the weapon that you're doing the guided attack with doesn't have one already. Otherwise, you have to use the guided version of that weapon. It's an interesting rework, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out in actual gameplay and meta scenarios. Another change in combat. Pistols lost their CC, with one exception, Cobra. You special little pistol, you. Unsure as to why, but I kind of like it too, because some pistols, they were great from a shooting mechanic, and then you got them into CC, and it was like, well, am I going to use the pistol? Am I going to use the CC weapon that is clearly potentially better, unless they had a really terrible CC? So again, I think this is maybe more of a tidying up and just going, well, of course you're not necessarily going to use your pistol in CC when you've got a sword hanging by your side. So really interesting change. Again, we'll be interested to see how that factors into actual gameplay. So MSV3. So equipment is going to come in phases because some of it's combat related and some of it's not. But MSV3 got actually quite a significant boost in N5. The boost I'm talking about here is that any unit with MSV3 can attack a camo unit without having it been discovered. And again, I really love that because I think MSV3 is actually quite rare. It's obviously quite top tier tech. Why shouldn't you be shooting at camo things, regardless whether you're certain as to what they are? So I love this. The tricky thing here is that you still apply mimetism and cover mods and everything like that. So while MSV typically reduces mimetism, MSV3 is the exception to a degree where if you're shooting a camo token or camo marker, you would actually still apply the mimetism to your attacks. And I think that's probably going to catch a couple of people out because of the universally accepted appreciation for MSV and mimetism is that they generally work against each other. So be interesting to see again if that causes confusion in a real game scenario, if you even have access to MSV3, but I like the fact that it got a bit of a bonus. I'm also going to quickly jump in and apologise for all those times that I've said wounds, when I should be saying vitality. Vitality is the new wound mechanic, and the reason for that is because there was confusion in the wording, as when it said add a wound, effectively marker to something, and then there was the wound meaning the life of the unit, it just didn't necessarily come across as clearly as it should do. So Corvus Belli have dealt with that by naming the life juice of a unit vitality, and structure, if it's a remote, and then basically saying it adds, or it takes away a wound, which is effectively a vitality. I think, again, it's a rules tidy up. A couple of really other big things. Vehicles are now a new unit type in M5. They did exist way back when, or at least they had mentioned, but there wasn't like a huge application for them. Now we get them fully. Vehicles are going to be a new trooper type for M5. Coming in with a lot of these hover bikes that we're seeing, which effectively move around quite a lot. You can't enter silhouette contact with them. They can't grab objectives. There's a whole bunch of things that they can't do, but they're fast, they shoot, they're going to be some quick attack units, and they are the vehicle troop type. Interesting changes to both hacking and fire teams. And that is, if you have multiple hackers in a fire team and they declare a hacking attack, they can declare different attacks. Fire teams have had a significant change in N5. Some people really like this change, some people really don't. Effectively, your fire team level is the number of units that have the same shared keyword name. So you might have a fire team of 3, but if only 2 of those units actually have the same keyword, then it would actually be a 2-level bonus, even though it's a Harris. There's more of a disconnection between the name of the fire team, core, Harris, duo, and the bonuses that you get for that. How a lot of us are seeing it is that it's a merging of the bonuses, like the pure and the mixed, into something that's more easy to understand. Will this translate to fire teams not being used as much and vanilla being used a lot more? We have yet to see, but it is an interesting change nonetheless. A couple of different ones here for you. Fairy Dust now affects vehicles and valid targets, expanding out to include the new trooper type. Spotlight gets a save against it, PS5, AP, so gonna be difficult, and it now boasts burst too. Not yet clear as to whether that's a buff to Spotlight or because there's now a save available to it, it does narrow its abilities. Will be interesting to see how that pans out. Motorcycles. We talked about the fact that you can't dismount from them, but you also now can't suppress Impetuous. Armed turrets are a brand new thing that you'll start to see in M5 games, and I've already seen some battle reports where they're being used quite aggressively. They are a new deployable perimeter weapon. For M5, they may only declare BS attacks and CC AROs. They could be some fantastic things in the game, could really serve as roadblocks for those factions that maybe struggled with roadblocks before. The other thing that's an interesting one is partial cover. There's 2 types of this partial cover. One of them is a partial cover that gives you +6 to your armor save but doesn't impact the shooting of your attacker. And there's some confusion as to whether that stacks with other types of partial cover. The rules say it doesn't stack with other partial cover mods, but what seems to be the case is that for your armor save, that wouldn't stack with the partial cover armor save necessarily, but the partial cover would still grant the -3 to the attacker. If it sounds confusing, read the rules. There's probably going to be a bit more of an explanation around this to make it simpler. It's a new mechanic, so I also think that's why there's some confusion. These can never take your mods up to a higher armor value than 12, kind of in keeping with Corvus Belli's generally. You can't go -12, you can't go +12, that sort of thing. But the 2 ones there, place deployable, partial cover that hates enemy troopers so they can't benefit from it, or smart barrier that grants you +6 armor. Again, new mechanics, might take a little while for this one to settle down. A couple of other new things that are going to take a bit of getting used to. Bang Bomb and Disco Baller. Sound like strange names. Some of them are complicated, some of them are quite simple. Bang Bomb is a plus mod to your dodging, effectively. So it's a cool type of new mechanic to give things a slightly better way of escaping from attacks. Again, we'll be interested to see how this pans out. The other one is Disco Baller. This is a weapon for N5, and what it does is it launches a temporary eclipse zone that turn off at the end of the player turn and can be reactivated subsequently by friendly deactivators using the new Activate Disco Ball skill. This will be interesting because it's placing something that has a limited lifespan, so could be easily forgotten about, but could also change late stage games, because if you've got a deactivator and it reactivates that, that would be really handy placement for an Eclipse Grenade. So again, this could be a really handy skill for those units or those armies that feel like they're very squishy and vulnerable. Could this really help? This next section needs a special shout out to Uri Shumroni, who has compiled all of this and focuses quite a lot on weapons and interactions. So I'm going to list these off and show you the rule changes themselves. We've got Immunity, Armor, and Enhance no longer cover para ammo, since the save attribute is pH. So that's a very technical, small tweak that you'll need to be aware of when using those. Immunity, BTS, and Enhanced do not stop stun ammo. The clarified immunity does not remove the non-lethal trait. Adhesive Launcher has been renamed Adhesive Launcher Rifle. Replacing a model with a model of a different size via transmutation is clarified. That's the rule I spoke about earlier. Thrown weapon renamed to BS weapon in brackets PH. I love that because it helps tie in the stat line that you are using. Technical weapon renamed BS weapon whip. Same rule, same reason why I love that. Smoke and Eclipse grenades changed to +3 range to 0. Offensive grenades still have the +3 range. All grenade launchers change +3 range to 0. Maybe a small nerfing of smoke grenades. Contender range bands changed, and the ammo types have changed too. Shotguns no longer have a blast mode at all. New weapon boarding pistol, PS7 with a direct template option. That's quite interesting. SMG ammo type now normal, not shock. New weapon variants, e.g. AP SMG, multi-Spitfire, multi-Red Fury, EM Carbine. Doctor Reroll X added. Doctor Reroll number. This is a nice, cool mechanic, and I like this because it's making something that has this skill better innately and reduces the chance of it failing, which is a huge issue that some people have, especially in tournaments. I don't use doctors because I can't rely on them to bring things back, and also it's a wasted order to some people. Stun ammo nerfed, we've already talked about that one. Infiltration can now have a pH equals instead of the confusing mods from N4, but you still apply the -3 to this new rule. Since the cover rules are decoupled from Impetuous, Frenzy now also applies limited cover as well when it activates. Limited cover, another interesting one. Special skill that imposes a reduced form of partial cover new for N5. Troopers with this special skill can benefit from the cover mod to saving rolls, but not the -3 mod normally provided by partial cover. So again, benefits you as the defender, but doesn't negatively impact the attacker. So anything that gets Frenzy will get this new type of cover, in that they will still get the bonuses to their armor saves and defense, but the attacker can still hit them without the -3. Isolated Lieutenant can still use the Lieutenant order if it was generated at the start of the turn, but NCO still cannot. Reflective trait, so white noise, also applies to troopers with marksmanship in addition to MSV. Albedo, now a mod and no longer time limited, also applies to marksmanship. So again, please, a special thank you to Yuri for compiling all of that and posting that for an easy debrief. That was a real technical dive into things that I definitely would have missed myself. Special Dice, SD, brand new mechanic for M5, and I think it's really exciting. What this does is if your unit has the SD and then a number next to it, that is the number of special dice you can add to attacks and things similar to that. What you have to do though, is once you've done your roll, adding the SD, you have to remove an equal number of dice that you added from the successes and then only count that. So it doesn't mean that you have more dice in theory against your opponent. It gives you an increased chance of having the dice you want in play at resolution step. It's a nice and cool mechanic. It will be interesting to see how fun it actually is in the game. If you're a Shaz Varsity player, then you might be interested to know that Seed Embryo is now no longer existing, but it's been replaced with a transmutation, hatching. I like this. I like that a lot of the changes that things can do have been moved to transmutation. It was something that I only rarely saw in M4 because only a couple of things had, and it was generally negative. I like that transmutation is becoming a more universal concept for when something changes its state. Another one, Veteran Rule has gone and has been replaced by Warhorse. Similar, but different. Some existing skills and new skills also emerge. Berserk is an interesting one. It's no longer normal rolls. applies face to face now, which is a big change. The requirement is to be within the sum of the user's move values has been removed, but there are explicit instructions on what happens if you declare the skill and you're not in range. So not a rule change as such, more of an optimization of how it's managed. Combat Instinct ignores surprise attack mods and cancels stealth. The surprise attacks mod cancellation is a bit the bioimmunity that we have now lost. So we're seeing that same mechanic, but just interwoven into a new skill. Natural Born Warrior. This was talked about quite a lot in the preview, in the run-up to M5, because it got shared and discussed quite a lot. Ignores all negative mods, including surprise attack, which makes it quite powerful and good. But what it doesn't do is cancel the attacker's positive mods, which is what the old Natural Born Warrior did. And that was really annoying because Natural Born Warrior would appear on some very cheap units that hadn't necessarily had the same martial arts skills that some of these really good attackers had had, and yet turned around and just went, nope, you cannot have any mods at all. Now all it does is take away the negative mods that would apply to the unit being attacked. Deactivators! We've talked about them a little bit because they have a special short skill now, or a special skill that can be used to activate disco balls that have become deactivated. They also have the added bonus that they no longer need line of fire. In order to work, they now need either line of sight or zone of control. This means you can now deactivate things through walls, which I think is a really nice buff to deactivators. FT Master is a new skill, but it kind of isn't. So one of the examples of FT Master is the Oznak and the Praetor Fireteam in Morats. What that meant was, and this is how it was played in M4 anyway, was that the Oznak had to be in that Fireteam in order for all of the Praetors and Gakis to remain regular, and for that Fireteam to exist. You couldn't then reform it if you lost the Oznak with just the Praetors and the Gaki, so it was an essential part of that. Effectively, rather than having that as a little line in the army builder and you kind of understand how to work it, that's just become an explicit skill now. So FT Master, in order for you to form a Fireteam of that type, so again, the Morats one now just directly translates to the Oznak being FT Master. Improvised is a new weapon trait for N5. Weapons with this trait, D charges, we're looking at you, impose a -6 CC mod on the user when it's being used as a CC weapon. So that is nerfing D charges in CC, which could be quite cool. No cover. Some troop types can never ever claim cover, regardless of what's going on. That is the no cover rule. It's formerly part of Impetuous. I wonder if this has been made so that if you have deployable cover, it doesn't get around the fact that you still can't claim it. Mine Layer X. So this doesn't appear as a rule in the N5 rulebook, but appears to be intended to work as ignoring the standard disposable rules for a weapon and might be giving a boost to whoever has this mine layer, or potentially a reduction. It gives greater flexibility for specific units to have more or less of something that used to have a standard disposable rule. Reload is a new mechanic, and I think this one's actually another cool one that's sneaking under the radar a little bit. So we all remember baggage in M4 and how that worked, and it was an entire order spent by the thing that needed to reload and had to be within zone of control of something with baggage. Not a problem with that order, quite liked it. Reload is now a common short skill, or ARO type, that can be used by a unit that's within zone of control of something with baggage. This makes it cheaper to reload, which I think is fantastic and will make those cheap units with lots of disposable weapons still very potent because it's going to be easier for them to be reloading their Panzerfaust and Flammen Spears or even mines. So really interesting there. It's a new skill that replaces some of the features of baggage that permitted troopers to reload disposables using the entire order in M4. Surprise Attack now gets an attribute mod, which is also quite interesting. For example, Surprise Attack CC-3 would impose a -3 mod to the opponent's CC attribute in a face-to-face roll against the surprise attacker. So very explicit uses here as to Surprise Attack. I'm sure this isn't finally because there's still probably a dozen things that I haven't mentioned, but it's on the long list here, and I just want to give a really good overview of what's changed without necessarily going too much into the weeds. The last one is Transmutation Whip. This is again another one. It's an additional form of transmutation new for M5. Each time the owner is activated by an order or ARO, make a free optional whip roll to trigger transmutation before declaring skills. Troopers revert to their initial profile at the end of the player turn. Quite interesting, quite cool. I think that's unit specific. When you look at that, you go, yeah, I can see why that would be useful or not. So in conclusion, N5 brings a raft of changes. One thing notable here is that there seems to be a further tidy up on the improvements that were made from N3 to N4. Corvus Belli are doing a fantastic job of keeping that train going, making the game even more playable and making things even clearer. What do you think about these N5 changes? Are you more excited to be playing N5 than you were for N4? Do you think the learning curve is going to be quite steep for those existing players that have to unlearn a whole bunch of things? What do you think this means for new players? Do you think this is going to make the game more accessible to them? Or do you think it's going to be even more complicated and we're actually going more towards N3 level of complexity for new people? I'm always keen to hear your thoughts, especially on changes this big. If you fancy doing so, please subscribe, please like the video. It really helps and helps me also understand which piece of content you value so that I can generate more of it. Thank you so much for watching and I'll be back soon.